So let's talk about heroes. Growing up, you hear these incredible stories, especially in Africa, about liberation heroes. These are the giants, the men and women who stood up to colonial powers and said no more. They promised freedom, equality, and a new dawn for their people. They were the rock stars of revolution, their faces on posters, their names chanted in the streets. You imagine them as these flawless figures like a real-life Black Panther. But without the high-tech suit and the awkward family reunions in Wakanda, they were meant to be the saviors who would lead their nations into a golden age of prosperity and justice. But here's the thing about stories, especially the ones we tell about our heroes. Sometimes we skip a few chapters, or more accurately, we only read the glowing introduction and then slam the book shut before we get to the part where the hero turns into the villain. It's a classic bait and switch. You think you're getting Nelson Mandela, but you end up with a guy who's more interested in gold-plated toilets than, feeding his people. It turns out that fighting for freedom and knowing how to govern with it are two very, very different skill sets. One requires courage and a loud voice, the other requires, not stealing all the money. And that's what we're diving into today. We're going to peel back the layers of propaganda and look at the legacies that have been, let's say, creatively edited. We're talking about the leaders who wore the mask of a liberator to hide the face of a tyrant. It's a journey through some of the continent's most complex and often tragic histories, where the line between savior and oppressor became incredibly blurry. So buckle up. Today, we're counting down the top 10 fake liberation heroes in African history. Kicking off our list at number 10 is Laurent-Désiré Kabila of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, to understand Kabila, you have to understand the guy he replaced, Mobutu Sese Seko, who we'll definitely be hearing more about later. Mobutu was the king of kleptocracy, a man who treated the national treasury like his personal piggy bank for over 30 years. So, when Kabila, a long-time, almost mythical rebel figure, marched into Kinshasa in 1997, people were ecstatic. They saw him as the man who finally toppled the leopard print hat-wearing dictator. The streets were filled with celebration. It was like the end of a very long, very corrupt movie. Kabila had been around for a while. He was a contemporary of Che Guevara who actually came to the Congo in the 60s to help the revolution and basically left thinking, you know what, these guys are not serious. Che wrote in his diary that Kabila was more interested in women and booze than in actual revolutionary strategy. It's like hiring a personal trainer who spends the whole session eating pizza on the treadmill. But decades later, with the backing of Rwanda and Uganda, Kabila finally got his moment. He was the liberator, the man who would cleanse the nation, then called Zaire, and restore its dignity as the DRC. But here's where the heroic narrative starts to fall apart, and fast. Almost immediately after taking power, Kabila's liberation started looking suspiciously like another dictatorship, just with a different guy in charge. He banned political parties, threw journalists in jail, and his former allies Rwanda and Uganda quickly turned on him when they realized he wasn't going to be their puppet. This sparked another devastating war, often called Africa's World War, because it dragged in so many neighboring countries. The hope for a new peaceful Congo evaporated into yet another cycle of violence and conflict. It was a classic case of meet the new boss, same as the old boss. People who had chanted his name in the streets were now whispering about his authoritarian tendencies. The economy, already in shambles after Mobutu, didn't improve. Corruption was still rampant. The grand promises of freedom and democracy were replaced by a grim reality of continued suffering. Kabila's rule was less of a new chapter and more of a disappointing sequel that nobody asked for. It was a stark reminder that getting rid of one bad guy doesn't automatically mean a good guy will take his place. Tragically, Kabila's story ends abruptly. He was assassinated in 2001 by one of his own bodyguards, a dramatic and violent end to a tenure that began with so much promise. His son, Joseph Kabila, took over, creating a de facto dynasty. The elder Kabila is remembered not as the great liberator he was meant to be, but as a transitional figure who ultimately failed to deliver the change the Congolese people so desperately needed. He broke the country free from Mobutu, only to trap it in a new web of conflict and authoritarianism, a truly disappointing start to our countdown. Coming in at number 9 is Liberia's Samuel Doe. His story is a wild ride, even by the standards of this list. In 1980, Liberia was run by the Americo-Liberians, descendants of freed American slaves who had established a society where they were the ruling class. For 130 years, they dominated politics and the economy, while the indigenous population was largely excluded. So when a 28-year-old master sergeant named Samuel Doe, from the indigenous Kron ethnic group, led a bloody coup, many saw it as a genuine popular uprising. It was the indigenous people finally taking charge of their own country. The coup itself was brutal. President William Tolbert was assassinated in the executive mansion, and 13 of his cabinet members were paraded naked through the streets of Monrovia before being publicly executed on a beach. It was shocking, violent, and for a lot of Liberians who had felt marginalized for generations, it felt like justice. Doe was their man. He was young. He spoke their language, and he promised an end to the corruption of the old regime. He was the liberator who would finally make Liberia a country for all its people, not just a privileged few. For a hot minute, it seemed like he might actually do it. He promised to hand power back to civilians, and there was a brief honeymoon period where the international community, including the United States, saw him as a potential ally in the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan famously called him Chairman Doe and welcomed him to the White House. He was the plucky underdog who had overthrown an old, tired government. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, pretty much everything. The promises of reform quickly dissolved. Doe's government became notorious for its own brand of corruption and, more dangerously, its ethnic favoritism. He promoted members of his own Kron group to positions of power, while brutally suppressing other ethnic groups, particularly the Geo and Mono. The so-called Liberation had just swapped one ruling elite for another. He rigged the 1985 election in his favor with such comical obviousness it was like a toddler trying to cheat at hide-and-seek by just closing his eyes. Dissent was met with extreme violence, and the country spiraled into a state of fear and paranoia. Doe's rule set the stage for one of Africa's most horrific civil wars. His repression and blatant theft of national resources created a powder keg of ethnic tension and resentment. And in 1989, that keg exploded when a man named Charles Taylor, and we'll be getting to him, launched a rebellion. Doe's end was as violent as his beginning. He was captured, tortured, and executed on camera by a rival warlord. His story is a cautionary tale of how a populist hero, celebrated for overthrowing an unjust system, can become a tyrant who unleashes even greater horrors upon his own people. At number 8, we travel to the Horn of Africa to talk about Mohamed Siad Barre of Somalia. When Barre seized power in a military coup in 1969, Somalia was a young nation struggling with clan divisions and political instability. Barre presented himself as the solution. He wasn't just another politician, he was a revolutionary. He introduced an ideology he called scientific socialism, which was basically a mix of Marxism and Somali nationalism. He declared war on clanism, the system of clan loyalties that had long defined Somali society, promoting a new national identity instead. Initially, his project had some incredible successes. He introduced a Latin script for the Somali language for the first time, which led to a massive literacy campaign that was praised by UNESCO. It was a huge step forward. He built roads, schools, and hospitals. He projected an image of a modernizing, unifying leader, the father of the nation, or Gulwad, the victory pioneer. For many Somalis, especially in the early years, it felt like a new beginning. He was the strong man who was finally going to whip the country into shape and drag it into the 20th century. But the problem with fathers, especially authoritarian ones, is that they demand absolute obedience. Barre's war on clanism was, in reality, a strategy to consolidate his own power. While he publicly condemned clan politics, he secretly and systematically favored his own Marahan clan, along with a couple of allied clans, placing them in all the key positions in the government and military. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. He was using the language of national unity to practice the most divisive form of clan-based favoritism. It was like a doctor telling you to stop eating sugar while he's funneling a bag of it into his mouth. This hypocrisy bred deep resentment. As his rule wore on, Barre became increasingly paranoid and brutal. His security services, especially the notorious National Security Service, became instruments of terror. People who opposed him, or were merely suspected of opposing him, were imprisoned, tortured, or simply disappeared. The dream of a unified Somalia curdled into a nightmare of state-sponsored oppression. His scientific socialism became a hollow excuse for a one-man, one-clan dictatorship that ruled through fear. The breaking point was the disastrous Ogaden War in the late 1970s, a failed attempt to annex a Somali-populated region of Ethiopia. The defeat shattered the myth of his military prowess and bankrupted the state. In the aftermath, Barre's regime grew even more vicious, particularly against clans in the north, leading to a full-blown genocide against the Isaac clan. This brutality sparked armed rebellions across the country, which eventually converged on the capital. In 1991, Barre was finally overthrown, fleeing Mogadishu in a tank. But he didn't leave behind a nation ready for a fresh start. He left behind a collapsed state, armed to the teeth and fractured along the very clan lines he claimed to have erased. His legacy is not liberation but the complete and utter disintegration of the Somali state, a chaos from which the country still hasn't fully recovered. For our number 7 spot, we go to West Africa, to Burkina Faso, and a story that is less about a fake hero from the start, and more about a hero who betrayed everything he supposedly stood for. This is the story of Blaise Compaoré, but you can't talk about Compaoré without first talking about his best friend, his brother-in-arms, the revolutionary icon Thomas Sankara. Sankara was a charismatic, visionary leader who, in just 4 years, transformed his country, which he renamed from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning Land of Incorruptible People. Sankara was the real deal. He was a pan-Africanist, a feminist, and environmentalist. He vaccinated millions of children, planted millions of trees, and promoted women to high positions in government. He lived modestly, ditching the presidential Mercedes for a Renault 5. He was a beacon of hope, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. And right by his side, his closest confidant and second-in-command was Blaise Compaoré. They were the dynamic duo, the architects of this incredible revolution. They were meant to change the world together, but as is so often the case in these stories, power dynamics get complicated. While Sankara was focused on radical, anti-imperialist change, some within the regime, including Compaoré, were growing uncomfortable. Sankara's revolutionary zeal was isolating them from powerful international allies like France and Côte d'Ivoire. They saw his rigid principles as a barrier to personal enrichment and political pragmatism. It's the classic rock band story. One guy wants to make art, the other guy wants to make money, and eventually, the band breaks up. Except here, the breakup was a bit more permanent. On October 15, 1987, Thomas Sankara was assassinated along with 12 of his aides in a violent coup d'état. And who took power immediately after? His best friend, Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré claimed that Sankara had been derailing the revolution and had to be stopped for the good of the nation. It was a shocking, unbelievable betrayal. He essentially murdered his brother, and then tried to convince everyone it was for his own good. It was the political equivalent of Cain telling God that Abel tripped and fell on a rock, repeatedly. Compaoré then spent the next 27 years systematically dismantling Sankara's legacy. He reversed the nationalizations, cozied up to France and international financial institutions, and amassed a huge personal fortune. The Land of Incorruptible People became just another country run by a corrupt strongman. He erased Sankara from the history books and ruled with an iron fist, silencing dissent and rigging elections. His entire reign was built on the ghost of the man he betrayed, a constant, chilling reminder of how revolutionary ideals can be murdered in cold blood by those who once championed them. He wasn't a liberator, he was the man who killed the liberator. At number 6 we have a man whose name is synonymous with the tragic arc from hero to villain, Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. For anyone who followed the struggle against white minority rule in southern Africa, Robert Mugabe was, for a long time, a giant. He was an intellectual, a teacher, a fiery revolutionary leader who spent a decade in prison for fighting against the racist regime of Rhodesia. When he and his ZANU-PF party came to power in 1980, leading to the birth of Zimbabwe, it was a moment of immense triumph and hope. In his early years as prime minister, Mugabe was praised even by his former enemies. His initial speech on reconciliation was incredible. He called for blacks and whites to work together to build a new nation. He said, "Let us turn our swords into plowshares." It was poetic, it was powerful, and for a while, it seemed to work. He massively expanded education and healthcare, leading to some of the best social indicators on the continent. Zimbabwe was called the Jewel of Africa. Mugabe was seen as a pragmatic, enlightened statesman, a model for post-colonial leadership. But underneath this veneer of statesmanship, a much darker reality was taking shape. As early as 1982, just 2 years after independence, Mugabe unleashed a brutal military campaign against his political rivals in the region of Matabeleland. This operation, known as Gukurahundi, was a state-sponsored massacre. The North Korean-trained 5th Brigade killed an estimated 20,000 civilians, mostly from the Ndebele ethnic group. It was a chilling preview of the ruthlessness he was capable of, a genocide that was largely ignored by the international community at the time, because they were still so invested in the Mugabe the hero narrative. As the years went on, the mask slipped completely. The pragmatist of the 1980s gave way to the paranoid tyrant of the 1990s and 2000s. Facing dwindling popularity and a strong opposition movement, Mugabe resorted to increasingly desperate and destructive measures. The most infamous of these was the chaotic and violent land reform program starting in 2000. While the issue of land inequality was real and needed to be addressed, his approach was to unleash so-called war veterans to violently seize white-owned farms. This wasn't a structured reform, it was state-sanctioned theft that crippled the country's agricultural backbone. The jewel of Africa became a basket case. The economy collapsed into a state of hyperinflation so absurd that the government was printing $100 trillion bills that were worth less than a loaf of bread. Political opponents were beaten, tortured, and killed. Elections were systematically rigged. Mugabe, the liberator who fought against a racist, oppressive regime, ended up creating his own, ruling for 37 years through fear, violence, and economic ruin. His story is perhaps the most poignant on this list, a tragic fall from grace that shows how the hero of the liberation struggle can become the oppressor of the very people he fought to free. Now we're getting into the top 5, and at number 5 we have Ethiopia's Mengistu Haile Mariam. To understand Mengistu, you have to understand the world he replaced. Ethiopia in 1974 was an ancient empire ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie, a figure revered by many around the world but who presided over a feudal, deeply unequal society. When a devastating famine hit the country and the imperial government seemed indifferent, the military stepped in. A committee of soldiers known as the Derg, or Committee, seized power, and a short, stout, and ambitious major named Mengistu quickly rose to the top. The revolution was initially popular. The Derg promised Ethiopia first and land reform. They were getting rid of a centuries-old monarchy that had kept millions of peasants in poverty. It felt like a genuine step towards modernity and equality. Mengistu, with his powerful voice and revolutionary rhetoric, positioned himself as the savior of the Ethiopian masses. He was the man who would finally break the chains of feudalism and lead Ethiopia into a bright socialist future. But Mengistu's version of socialism was less about collective prosperity and more about absolute brutal control. After consolidating his power by, and this is true, literally executing his rivals within the Derg in a shootout during a committee meeting, he unleashed one of the most terrifying campaigns of political violence in modern African history, the Red Terror. This was a direct response to a rival Marxist group that was challenging the Derg's authority. Mengistu's solution was simple and horrifying. In a public square in Addis Ababa, Mengistu held up bottles filled with a red liquid, symbolizing the blood of his enemies, smashed them on the ground, and declared war on anyone he deemed a counter-revolutionary. What followed was a state-sponsored slaughter. Security forces and civilian militias were given license to kill anyone suspected of opposition. University students, intellectuals, labor leaders, thousands were murdered, their bodies often left in the streets with a bill for the bullet pinned to them, which their families had to pay to retrieve the body for burial. It was a level of cruelty that is hard to comprehend. On top of this political terror, his government's disastrous agricultural policies, forcing peasants into collective farms, contributed to another horrific famine in the mid-1980s, the one that prompted the Live Aid concerts. While the world was singing "We Are the World," Mengistu's government was actively blocking food aid to rebel-held areas, using starvation as a weapon of war. The man who came to power promising to end the suffering caused by famine presided over an even worse one. He overthrew an emperor only to become a far more bloodthirsty tyrant. When his regime finally collapsed in 1991, Mengistu fled to Zimbabwe, where he was sheltered by his old friend, Robert Mugabe. He was tried in absentia in Ethiopia and found guilty of genocide, a liberator whose legacy is written in blood. At number 4, we have a man whose name became a global shorthand for brutal African dictator Idi Amin Dada of Uganda. When General Amin seized power in a military coup in 1971, Overthrowing President Milton Obote, there was actually a sigh of relief in many quarters. Obote's government had become increasingly repressive, and Amin, the former heavyweight boxing champion and army chief, was initially welcomed by the Ugandan people and even by Western governments like Britain and Israel. He was seen as a simple, charismatic soldier who would restore stability. Amin played the part of the populist liberator perfectly. He was a man of the people, unpolished and unpredictable. He would stage mock battles, hold impromptu rallies, and his eccentric larger-than-life personality was, for a time, captivating. He presented himself as a true African nationalist standing up to foreign influence. One of his first major acts was the 1972 expulsion of Uganda's entire Asian population, who had long dominated the country's commercial sector. He gave them 90 days to leave, claiming he was giving Uganda back to the Ugandans. It was a move that was popular with many, who saw it as economic liberation. But this economic liberation was a catastrophe. Amin handed the businesses and properties seized from the Asians to his cronies and soldiers, who had no idea how to run them. The economy collapsed almost overnight. Shortages became the norm. This was just the beginning of the nightmare. Amin's regime quickly descended into a reign of terror characterized by extreme paranoia and unspeakable violence. His charisma was a mask for a deep-seated brutality that would define his 8 years in power. His security forces, like the State Research Bureau and the Public Safety Unit, became private death squads. Anyone perceived as a threat, intellectuals, judges, religious leaders, rival ethnic groups, former government officials, was fair game. People were dragged from their homes and workplaces never to be seen again. The estimates of those killed range from 100,000 to 500,000. Stories of his cruelty became legendary, feeding bodies to crocodiles in the Nile, keeping the heads of his enemies in a freezer, and his bizarre, self-proclaimed titles like His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. The man who was welcomed as a stabilizer had become the country's greatest source of terror. His rule was not a liberation, it was an 8-year-long public execution. His regime finally ended in 1979 when neighboring Tanzania, after Amin foolishly tried to annex part of their territory, invaded and sent him fleeing into exile, first to Libya and then to Saudi Arabia, where he lived until his death in 2003. Idi Amin was never a liberator. He was a caricature of a tyrant, a brutal buffoon whose legacy is nothing but death, destruction, and a chilling lesson in how quickly a supposed savior can become a monster. Cracking our top 3 is a man who took the concept of liberation and twisted it into a carnival of horror. Charles Taylor of Liberia. Taylor's story begins where Samuel Doe's left off. After serving in Doe's government and then fleeing to the United States on embezzlement charges, Taylor escaped from a Massachusetts prison in a manner that is still debated. Some say it was a simple jailbreak, others whisper about CIA involvement. Whatever the case, he resurfaced on Christmas Eve, 1989, leading a small band of rebels from Côte d'Ivoire into Liberia, vowing to liberate the country from Doe's tyranny. His rebel group was called the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or NPFL. His slogan was catchy and honestly chillingly cynical. He killed my ma, he killed my PA, but I will vote for him. It was an open admission that his path to power would be violent, but he framed it as a necessary evil to get rid of the greater evil, Samuel Doe. Many Liberians, desperate for any alternative to Doe's brutal regime, initially supported Taylor. They saw him as the liberator who would finally end their suffering. But Taylor's liberation was a descent into hell. The First Liberian Civil War, which he started, was not a disciplined military campaign. It was an orgy of violence characterized by the use of child soldiers, widespread massacres, rape, and even cannibalism. Taylor's forces were notorious for their brutality. They weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to terrorize, to destroy the very fabric of society. The war he unleashed shattered Liberia, killing over 200,000 people and displacing millions. After years of brutal fighting and a shaky peace deal, an election was held in 1997. And here's the truly insane part. Charles Taylor won. He won with 75% of the vote. Why? Mostly out of fear. The Liberian people, exhausted by war, essentially voted for the man they believed would bring peace, even if it was the peace of the graveyard. They voted for him because they were terrified that if he lost, he would simply start the war all over again. It was the ultimate hostage situation, where the entire country was the hostage. As president, Taylor ran Liberia like a personal criminal enterprise. He plundered the nation's resources, particularly diamonds and timber, not to rebuild the country, but to enrich himself and to fuel another even more brutal conflict in neighboring Sierra Leone. This is where the term blood diamonds entered the global vocabulary. He was arming and directing the RUF rebels in Sierra Leone, infamous for hacking off the limbs of civilians in exchange for diamonds. The liberator of Liberia had become the butcher of Sierra Leone. He was finally forced from power in 2003 and was eventually arrested. In 2012, he was convicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone for war crimes and crimes against humanity, the first former head of state to be convicted by an international tribunal since Nuremberg. He wasn't a hero, he was a warlord in a suit. Our runner-up for the fakest liberation hero is a man so cartoonishly evil, so flamboyantly tyrannical, that he almost defies belief. I'm talking about Jean-Bédel Bokassa of the Central African Republic. Bokassa was a veteran of the French army who rose through the ranks of his own country's military after independence. In 1966, on New Year's Eve, he led a coup against his cousin, President David Dacko, claiming the government was corrupt and the country was on the brink of collapse. He was the strong man coming to clean house. For the first few years he played the part of the dedicated, if eccentric, leader. He built some infrastructure and presented himself as a father figure to the nation, insisting everyone call him Papa. But the Papa had some very dark secrets and a growing obsession with his personal hero, Napoleon Bonaparte. This obsession wasn't just a casual interest, it was the guiding principle of his increasingly bizarre and brutal rule. He saw himself as a grand historical figure destined for imperial glory. This delusion reached its absolute peak on December 4, 1977. In a ceremony that was a grotesque parody of Napoleon's coronation, Bokassa crowned himself Emperor Bokassa I of the Central African Empire. The event cost an estimated $20 million, which was roughly a quarter of the country's entire annual budget. He had a 2-ton solid gold throne shaped like an eagle, a diamond-encrusted crown, and robes that cost more than most of his citizens would see in 1,000 lifetimes. All of this was happening in one of the poorest countries on the planet. It was beyond absurd, it was a crime. While he was playing dress-up, his people were suffering under a regime of incredible cruelty. The national treasury was his personal bank account. He would personally beat and torture prisoners, and there were credible, horrifying reports that he engaged in cannibalism, even serving the flesh of his political opponents to unsuspecting foreign dignitaries. His brutality was not just political, it was personal and sadistic. He ruled through sheer terror, and the empire was his personal fiefdom of fear. The final straw came in 1979. When school children protested against a new law forcing them to buy expensive school uniforms made in a factory owned by one of Bokassa's wives, his imperial guard cracked down. Over 100 children were arrested and massacred, with reports that Bokassa himself participated in the killings. This atrocity finally shocked the world, and his longtime patrons, the French, had had enough. While Bokassa was on a trip to Libya, French paratroopers landed in the capital, overthrew his empire, and reinstalled the very same man he had overthrown 13 years earlier, David Dacko. Bokassa's story is a monument to megalomania, a terrifying example of how a so-called liberator can become a monstrous, self-aggrandizing emperor living in a fantasy world built on the misery of his people. And here we are, the #1 spot on our list of fake liberation heroes, the master, the blueprint, the man who turned state looting into an art form, Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mobutu's rise to power is tangled up in the chaos of Congo's independence in 1960. As a young army chief of staff, he played a key role in the crisis that led to the arrest and eventual murder of the country's first democratically elected prime minister, the Pan-African icon Patrice Lumumba. With CIA backing, Mobutu consolidated power, finally launching his own coup in 1965, claiming he was saving the nation from political chaos. Mobutu then launched a campaign called Authenticity. The country's name was changed from Congo to Zaire. European place names were replaced with African ones. People were forced to drop their Christian names for African ones. And Mobutu himself adopted his famously long name, Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu Wazabanga, which translates to the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, will go from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. It was the ultimate rebranding. He positioned himself as the father of the nation, the decolonizer, the man who was restoring African pride. He was a master of political theater. He cultivated a powerful personality cult, with his face appearing on TV every night before the news, descending from the heavens like a god. His leopard skin hat became an iconic symbol of his power, and for years during the Cold War, he was a key ally of the West, particularly the United States and France. They saw him as a bulwark against Soviet influence in Central Africa, so they looked the other way as he established one of the most corrupt regimes in history. He was their guy, so his, let's call them quirks, were overlooked. And what were those quirks? Well, primarily it was stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. Mobutu perfected the art of kleptocracy, which literally means rule by thieves. He and his elite circle treated the vast mineral wealth of Zaire, its copper, cobalt and diamonds, as their personal property. While his people languished in extreme poverty, with schools and hospitals crumbling, Mobutu amassed a personal fortune estimated to be in the billions. He owned palaces in Zaire and lavish villas across Europe. He would charter a Concorde jet to go on shopping sprees in Paris. For 32 years, he bled his country dry. The liberator who promised to end the chaos and unify the nation had in fact institutionalized corruption and decay on an unimaginable scale. He famously told his people, if you want to steal, steal a little cleverly, in a nice way. Only if you steal so much as to become rich overnight, you will be caught. He wasn't just a leader, he was a mafia boss. By the time he was overthrown in 1997 by Laurent Kabila, the man who started our list, Zaire was a hollowed-out shell of a country. Mobutu Sese Seko is the ultimate fake liberation hero, because he not only failed to liberate his people from poverty and strife, he actively created and profited from it on a scale that is still staggering to this day. So there you have it. 10 stories of men who promised the world and delivered ruin. From Kabila's squandered opportunity to Mobutu's 30-year heist, it's a sobering look at how the dream of liberation can be twisted into a nightmare of oppression. These leaders mastered the language of freedom. They knew how to rally a crowd, how to point the finger at a common enemy, and how to wrap themselves in the flag of revolution. But their legacies teach us a crucial lesson. True leadership isn't about seizing power. It's about what you do with it. It's about service, not self-enrichment. About building institutions, not just personality cults. This is why understanding our history, in all its uncomfortable complexity, is so important. It's easy to accept the simple, heroic myths we're told. It's much harder, but far more valuable, to dig deeper, to ask the tough questions, and to challenge the official narratives. Who benefited from this person's rule? Who suffered? What was the real price of their liberation? By examining these fallen heroes, we learn to spot the warning signs and to demand more from the leaders of today and tomorrow. We learn that patriotism is not blind loyalty to one person, but a commitment to the well-being of all people. So I encourage you, go read, go research, and question everything. Look beyond the statues and the slogans. The stories we've talked about today are not just chapters in a history book, they are living legacies that continue to affect millions of people across the continent. They remind us that the fight for true freedom is an ongoing process, one that requires constant vigilance from all of us. Remember, not every hero wears a cape, and some never deserved one in the first place.